There are moments in life when a person must choose between their own freedom and the souls they brought into the world. Most of us will never face such a decision, but Sallie Crane faced it not once, but 3 times. The year was 1853, and along the Tombigbee River in western Alabama, a woman stood at the edge of a dense forest, her feet bleeding, her dress torn from days of running. Behind her lay the promise of liberation, Canada, the North, a life where she would answer to no master. Before her, back through those dark woods, back past the men with dogs and guns, lay something more precious than her own breath: her children. 3 times she would make this journey into freedom. 3 times she would turn back. And what she would endure in the space between those escapes would test the very limits of what a human being can survive. But before we understand why Sallie Crane made the choices that would define her life, we must first understand the world that forced such choices upon her, a world where love itself could become the cruelest weapon of all. Before we continue with Sallie's incredible story, please leave a like if you appreciate these forgotten chapters of American history. Your support helps us bring these voices back from silence. The Thornton Plantation sat in Clark County, Alabama, approximately 15 miles from the growing town of Grove Hill. It was not the largest plantation in the county. There were estates twice its size along the river, but it was prosperous enough. 300 acres of cotton, a main house of modest elegance, and 42 enslaved people who worked the fields from dawn until the last light faded from the sky. Robert Thornton had inherited the property from his father in 1848. At 32 years old, he was considered a modern plantation owner. He did not personally whip his slaves, preferring to delegate such matters to his overseer. He kept meticulous records of production and expenditures. He attended church every Sunday and considered himself a reasonable man. His wife, Margaret, was known throughout the county for her delicate constitution and frequent nervous complaints. She rarely left her upstairs bedroom, and the running of the household fell to the senior house slaves, chief among them a woman named Sallie. Sallie had been born on the plantation in 1823, the daughter of a field worker named Ruth and a father whose name no one spoke aloud, though everyone knew he had been a white man, probably a traveling merchant who had visited the plantation when Ruth was 15. Sallie's lighter skin ensured she would never work the fields. At age 7, she had been brought into the main house to train as a domestic servant. She learned quickly. By 14, she managed the entire household, directing the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, ensuring that Mrs. Thornton's complicated dietary requirements were met, that Mr. Thornton's shirts were pressed to perfection, that the house ran like a well-wound clock. She was, by all accounts, invaluable. And valuable things, Robert Thornton believed, should be kept close. When Sallie was 16, she was given a small room off the kitchen, a privilege that separated her from the quarters where the other slaves lived. It was presented as a reward for her excellent service. She understood it as something else entirely, a convenience that required no explanation. By 17, Sallie was pregnant with her first child. She never spoke the father's name, just as her mother had never spoken hers. But when the baby was born, a girl with Sallie's features and skin almost as light as parchment, certain conclusions became unavoidable to everyone on the plantation. Mrs. Thornton took to her bed for a week with one of her nervous attacks. Thornton remained impassive, noting the birth in his ledger with the same careful script he used for all property acquisitions. Female child born to Sallie, healthy, named Louisa. 3 more children followed over the next 7 years. Another daughter, Beatrice, in 1842, a son, Thomas, in 1844, and finally, in 1846, another son she named Marcus. 4 children. 4 souls that tied Sallie to the Thornton plantation more securely than any chains. The other slaves understood. Sallie worked in the main house, and her children lived better than those born in the quarters. They had better food, better clothing, and were kept from the fields. But they also understood the price Sallie paid for these small mercies. The quiet indignities that left no marks, but cut deeper than any lash. By 1852, Louisa was 11 years old, old enough to begin learning the household work her mother had mastered. Beatrice was 9, Thomas 7, and Marcus 5. They were beautiful children, all of them, and intelligent. Sallie had taught them their letters in secret, using charcoal on wood when no one was watching, a dangerous gift that could earn them all a whipping if discovered. She loved them with a ferocity that terrified her, because she knew, as every enslaved mother knew, that this love was a vulnerability. The children could be sold at any moment. They could be taken from her on nothing more than a whim or an accountant's calculation. They could disappear into the vast machinery of the slave trade, and she would never know what became of them. The only thing worse than losing them, Sallie came to believe, would be for them to remain here, growing up in the shadow of the main house, repeating the same cycle of quiet degradation that had defined her own life. It was this thought that first planted the seed of escape in her mind. Not freedom for herself alone, but freedom for her children, a life where they could be something other than property. But escaping with 4 children, the youngest barely past toddlerhood, was impossible. The dogs would catch them within hours. They would be returned, punished, and watched more carefully than ever before. No, if she wanted to save them, she would need to be strategic. She would need to escape first, establish herself somewhere in the north, and then return for them. It was dangerous, perhaps insane, but the alternative, doing nothing, accepting their fate, had become unthinkable. What Sallie didn't know, as she began to formulate her plan in the spring of 1852, was that Robert Thornton was facing his own calculations. Cotton prices had fallen. Debts were accumulating. And among his assets, 4 young children of ambiguous parentage represented a complicated problem that could alternatively represent a solution. The collision between Sallie's desperate hope and Thornton's cold mathematics would set in motion a chain of events that would become legend along the Tombigbee River. A story whispered among the slaves, denied by the whites, but never quite forgotten. It was late April when Sallie first heard the conversation that would change everything. She was cleaning the study, a task she performed every Tuesday afternoon while Mr. Thornton attended to business in Grove Hill. But on this particular Tuesday, Thornton had returned early, and he was not alone. Thomas Sykes, a slave trader from Mobile, sat across from him in the leather chair by the window. Sallie heard their voices as she approached with her cleaning supplies. She should have announced herself, but something in Thornton's tone made her pause just outside the door, which stood slightly ajar. "The children are well-mannered and healthy," Thornton was saying. "The oldest 2 girls could work in a house immediately. The boys are young but strong." "The mother?" Sykes asked. "She won't be sold. Too valuable here. But the children are a different matter." "My wife." He trailed off, and Sallie could hear the clink of glasses, the pour of whiskey. "It would ease certain tensions in the household. I can offer 300 for the lot. The youngest is too young to be worth much, but the older girl, if she's as light as you say, might fetch more in the New Orleans market. Certain houses prefer—" 300 is acceptable," Thornton interrupted, his voice suddenly cold. "But there will be conditions. The transaction must be handled discreetly. I don't want trouble from the other slaves. They're to be collected at night quickly with minimal disturbance." "When?" "End of May. I'll send word." Sallie stood in the hallway, the cleaning rags clutched in her hands, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. 4 weeks. She had 4 weeks until her children would be loaded onto a wagon and disappeared into the vast nightmare of the Deep South slave trade. 4 weeks to do something impossible. She ran that night. Not with careful planning or strategic calculation, but with the pure panic of a mother who has just learned her children are to be torn from her. She waited until the house was dark, until she was certain the Thorntons were asleep, and then she simply walked out the back door and into the forest. She knew about the Underground Railroad. Every slave knew about it, though the details were vague and contradictory. Go north, find the river. Look for houses with quilts hanging in specific patterns. Trust certain people, avoid others. It was more rumor than information, but it was all she had. For 3 days, Sallie traveled north through the Alabama wilderness. She moved at night, hid during the day, drank from streams, ate nothing. She could hear the dogs in the distance sometimes searching, but the heavy spring rains had made tracking difficult, and she had rubbed her feet and legs with wild onions to confuse the scent. On the 4th day, hungry and exhausted, she reached the Tennessee border. A freedman in a small settlement there gave her bread and told her she would need to continue northeast toward Nashville, where she might find people who could help. He gave her the name of a church, a password to speak at the door. Sallie stood at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. Before her lay the path to Tennessee, to Nashville, to freedom. Behind her back through all those dangerous miles were Louisa, Beatrice, Thomas, and Marcus. She thought of her oldest daughter, who sang while she worked and had a gift for making people smile. She thought of Beatrice, serious and watchful, who noticed everything. She thought of Thomas, who loved stories and would beg Sallie to tell him about places beyond the plantation. She thought of Marcus, who still sometimes crawled into her bed at night, seeking the comfort of her presence. 4 weeks until they were sold. If she continued north, she might eventually establish herself somewhere, earn money, and try to buy them. But that could take years, and by then they could be anywhere, scattered across the South, impossible to trace. If she went back now, she would be punished, but they would still be there. The choice seemed impossible, but for Sallie it was actually very simple. She turned around and began walking south. She arrived back at the Thornton Plantation on the 6th night after her escape. She walked directly to the main house and knocked on the door. When Robert Thornton opened it, candle in hand, she stood on the porch and said simply, "I came back. Please don't sell my children." What happened next would become the subject of much debate in the years that followed. Some said Thornton was moved by her plea. Others said his calculations had simply changed. A slave who would voluntarily return from freedom was a slave who could be controlled through her children, a valuable realization. Whatever his reasons, Thornton did not have her whipped. He did not sell her children in May as planned. Instead, he locked Sallie in a small storage room beneath the kitchen for 2 weeks, feeding her 1 meal a day, allowing her to see her children through a grate in the door, but not touch them. When he finally released her, he explained the new arrangement very clearly. She would continue her work as before. Her children would remain on the plantation. But if she ever attempted to escape again, all 4 children would be sold immediately, separately, to the farthest corners of the Deep South, and she would never see them again. "Do you understand?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Sallie said. She understood perfectly. She understood that her love for her children had become her prison, that Thornton now possessed a weapon against her that was more effective than any chains. She understood that she was trapped, and that her children were trapped through her. What Thornton didn't understand was that Sallie's first escape had taught her something crucial. It was possible. The North existed. Freedom existed. The route was dangerous but navigable. And most importantly, she had learned that she possessed something rare and valuable, the ability to walk away from everything and the strength to walk back. She would escape again. But next time, she would have a better plan. The months following Sallie's first escape brought changes to the Thornton plantation, subtle at first, then increasingly oppressive. Robert Thornton hired a new overseer, a man named William Pike, who had a reputation for preventing runaways. Pike was a compact man with pale eyes that seemed to never blink, and he had a peculiar talent for appearing wherever slaves gathered to talk quietly among themselves. Conversations would die mid-sentence when Pike's shadow fell across them. Sallie's movements were now restricted. She could no longer walk freely to the quarters to visit with the other slaves. She was not permitted to leave the main house without permission. Her children remained with her, but Pike checked on them 3 times daily, as if counting inventory. Mrs. Thornton emerged from her bedroom more frequently, her nervous condition apparently improved by Sallie's attempted escape, or perhaps by the increased control that now governed the household. She took to supervising Sally's work personally, standing in doorways, watching, finding fault with small details that had never mattered before. "The silver isn't bright enough," she would say. Or, "This dinner is under-seasoned." Or, "Why are you moving so slowly today, Sally? Are you unwell?" The questions always carried a hidden meaning, a suggestion that perhaps Sally was conserving energy for another escape attempt, that she was unreliable, that she bore watching. But it was the children who suffered most from this new scrutiny. Louisa, at 12, was now old enough to begin real household work. Mrs. Thornton assigned her to scrubbing floors, polishing boots, and emptying chamber pots. Tasks far beneath what her skills warranted. Tasks clearly designed to humiliate. The girl bore it with quiet dignity, but Sally could see the light dimming in her daughter's eyes, the way she had begun to carry herself with the defeated posture of someone who had learned too early that hope was dangerous. Beatrice was put to work in the kitchen, where the cook, a woman who had never forgiven Sally for her privileged position in the household, worked her mercilessly and reported every small mistake to Mrs. Thornton. The child's hands, soft from a childhood relatively free of hard labor, became red and raw from washing dishes in scalding water. Thomas and Marcus were still too young for serious work, but Pike had begun taking them out to the fields for training, teaching them, he said, the labor they would eventually perform. They returned in the evenings exhausted and frightened, with stories about the field hands who had been whipped for moving too slowly or talking back. "Mama," Thomas said one night, "Mr. Pike says that children who come from sin grow up to be sinners too. He says that's why we need to be corrected more than other children." "What does he mean?" Sally held her son and said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would make sense of the casual cruelty that now governed their lives. She began to understand that this was the real punishment for her escape. Not the 2 weeks in the storage room, but this slow, deliberate campaign to break her spirit by destroying her children's futures piece by piece. And it was working. There were nights when Sally lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a mistake by returning. Perhaps if she had continued north, if she had established herself in freedom, she could have eventually sent help. Perhaps there were networks, organizations, people who facilitated the rescue of children from slavery. Perhaps her desperate need to be near them had actually doomed them to a worse fate. These thoughts circled in her mind like buzzards, feeding on her doubt. It was during one of these sleepless nights, in the late autumn of 1853, that Sally overheard another conversation, not by accident this time, but by deliberate eavesdropping. She had learned to move silently through the main house, to position herself near doorways when Thornton had visitors, to listen for information that might prove useful. This time, the visitor was Thornton's brother James, who managed a plantation in Mississippi. The two men were in the study, and Sally stood just outside in the hallway, ostensibly polishing the whole table, her ears straining to catch every word. "You should sell them," James was saying. "The older one especially. She'll fetch a good price and it'll solve your problem with Margaret." "Sally's too valuable," Robert replied. "I can't replace her. She knows how to manage everything, and Margaret trusts her work, even if she doesn't trust anything else about her." "Then keep Sally, but sell the children. All of them. Once they're gone, she'll have no reason to run and no leverage. You'll have complete control." There was a long pause. Sally's hands had stopped moving, frozen on the table's surface. "The trader from Mobile returns every 6 months," James continued. "His next visit is scheduled for early January. You could have this resolved by the new year." "I'll consider it," Robert said finally. Sally resumed her polishing, her movements mechanical, her mind racing. January. She had 2 months, perhaps less. The first escape had been impulsive, driven by panic. It had failed because she had no real plan, no resources, no destination beyond the vague idea of north. But she had also learned valuable lessons from that attempt, lessons about the routes, the timing, the methods of evading pursuit. More importantly, she had learned something about herself. She could survive the journey. She was strong enough, determined enough, and sufficiently willing to sacrifice anything for her children's freedom. The second escape would be different. This time, she would be prepared. Some mysteries are about what happened. Others are about what people are willing to risk to change what might happen. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see where Sallie's determination will lead, because what comes next defied everything her world believed possible. Planning an escape while under constant surveillance required a kind of cunning that Sallie had never needed before. Every action had to serve two purposes: the visible purpose that satisfied her watchers and the hidden purpose that advanced her secret plan. She began by becoming the perfect slave. She worked longer hours, volunteered for additional tasks, accepted every criticism from Mrs. Thornton with a deferential nod. She kept her children quiet and obedient, teaching them to be invisible in the way that enslaved people had learned to be invisible for generations, there in body, but carefully absent in any way that might draw attention or displeasure. Weeks passed. The surveillance gradually relaxed. Pike still checked on the children, but less frequently. Mrs. Thornton still watched, but with less intensity. The message seemed clear. Sallie had been broken by her first failed escape, and the threat to her children kept her perfectly compliant. This was exactly what Sallie needed them to believe. While performing her household duties, she began stealing small items, things that might not be missed or whose absence could be explained. A kitchen knife, no larger than her palm, wrapped in cloth and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. Matches, taken one or two at a time from the box kept on the mantel. A blanket with a small burn hole destined for the rag pile, which she claimed to have thrown away but actually folded and hid beneath her mattress. She also stole food, but only in the most careful way, slightly undersalting the meals she prepared and keeping the extra salt for herself, overestimating the flour needed for bread and secreting away the excess handful by handful, claiming that the chickens were laying poorly while actually hiding 2 eggs a week in a tin buried behind the kitchen building. It took weeks to accumulate enough supplies for a journey, longer still to gather information. The other slaves became her inadvertent intelligence network. When they gathered in the quarters after the day's work, Sallie found reasons to visit, delivering messages from the main house, bringing medicine for a sick child, mending clothes. She would stay just long enough to listen to the conversations, to hear the news that traveled through the slave grapevine faster than any newspaper. She learned about a freedman in Mobile who helped runaways find passage on ships heading north. She learned about a Quaker family near the Georgia border who hid fugitives in a cellar beneath their barn. She learned about a route through the Tombigbee River swamps where the dogs couldn't track a scent, and a settlement of Maroons, escaped slaves living in the wilderness who might offer shelter to those passing through. Most importantly, she learned about a woman in Tennessee called the Shepherd, who coordinated a network of safe houses stretching all the way to Ohio. No one knew her real name, but the stories about her were consistent. She had personally escorted more than 50 fugitives to freedom, and she specialized in the most difficult cases: families with children, pregnant women, people whom others had written off as impossible to save. If Sallie could reach the Shepherd, she thought, there might be a chance to bring her children out. Not immediately. She understood now that a second escape would have to look like the first, a solitary flight. But once she reached safety, once she had established herself, she could send word back through the network. The Shepherd could be contacted. Plans could be made. It seemed impossible, a fantasy born of desperation, but it was the only plan Sallie had. By late November, she was ready. The supplies were hidden. The route was memorized. The timing was calculated down to the hour. She would leave on a moonless night during the week when Thornton traveled to Mobile for business. Pike would still be on the plantation, but he usually slept heavily after his evening drinking, and Sallie knew which floorboards in the main house creaked and which were silent. She set the date, December 3rd, 1853. But 3 days before her planned escape, something unexpected happened that would change everything about her calculations. It was late afternoon, and Sallie was preparing dinner when Louisa came running into the kitchen, her face flushed with excitement and fear. "Mama," she gasped. "There's a man here. He came to the quarters looking for you. He says he has a message from your mother." Sallie's mother, Ruth, had been sold to a plantation in Georgia 5 years earlier, part of an estate settlement after old Mr. Thornton died. Sallie had not seen her since, and had received no word of whether she was even still alive. "What man?" Sallie asked carefully. "What did he look like?" "He's young, a house slave from the Crawford place, I think. He said his name is Benjamin, and he'll be working in the stable tonight, repairing Mr. Thornton's carriage. He said you should come see him after sunset, when the work is done." Everything about this scenario raised alarm. Slaves from other plantations didn't simply appear with messages. The timing, just days before her planned escape, was suspiciously convenient. And yet, if her mother really had sent word, if she was in trouble or had information, Sallie made her decision. She would meet this Benjamin, but she would be careful. That evening, after the dinner was cleared and the dishes were washed, Sallie told Mrs. Thornton that she needed to check on a sick child in the quarters. It was a weak excuse, but Mrs. Thornton was already in the drowsy state brought on by her evening laudanum, and she waved Sallie away with barely a glance. The stable was dark, except for a single lantern hanging from a beam. Sallie could see a figure moving in the shadows, and as she approached, a young man stepped into the light. He was indeed young, perhaps 20, with the careful, watchful posture of someone who had learned to be cautious. "You're Sallie?" he asked quietly. "Who sent you?" "Your mother didn't send me," he said. "But I know her. I know she's in Georgia, working on a tobacco farm near Augusta. She's well, if you were wondering." "Then why are you here?" Benjamin looked around nervously, then stepped closer. "Because I was asked to find you, by the shepherd." Sallie's breath caught. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Word travels in ways that white folks don't understand. Word has traveled that you're planning to run again, that you tried once before and came back for your children. The shepherd wants you to know that this is a mistake." "I didn't ask for her opinion," Sallie said, her voice sharper than she intended. "She says, if you run alone again, you'll face the same choice. You'll get far enough to taste freedom, and then you'll turn back because your children are still here. And when you turn back this time, Thornton will have you whipped or worse, and your children will be sold anyway out of spite. Then what am I supposed to do?" The question came out like a plea. Benjamin glanced around again, then pulled a small piece of cloth from his pocket. It was dark blue, with a distinctive pattern of stars sewn in white thread. "Do you recognize this?" Sallie shook her head. "It's a signal. When you see a quilt with this pattern hanging from a porch or a window, it means that house is part of the network. Safe, but only for one night." He pressed the cloth into her hand. "The shepherd says if you're determined to try again, wait. Wait until late December after the trader comes and goes. If your children are still here after Christmas, it means Thornton has decided to keep them for now. That gives you time." "Time for what?" "To run, but differently this time. There's a route that could work, but it's dangerous and you'd need to move fast. After you escape, you'd head northeast to Tennessee just like before. But this time, you wouldn't stop there. You'd continue all the way to Ohio, to a settlement called New Richmond, right on the river. The shepherd would meet you there. And then she would help you plan something very few people have ever attempted. Going back south to retrieve your children. But Sallie, listen to me carefully. This is extraordinarily dangerous. Most people who try to go back don't make it. They're captured, killed, or they find that the people they came back for have already been sold and moved. The shepherd will help you, but she can't promise success. She can only promise that she'll try." Sallie looked down at the small piece of cloth in her hand. A signal, a promise, a possibility. "Why would she do this?" she asked. "She doesn't know me." The shepherd believes that every person who escapes and makes it to freedom proves that the whole system is a lie, and every person who goes back to save their family proves something even more powerful, that love is stronger than the chains they use to bind us. She says these stories are what keep the rest of us hoping, planning, believing that freedom is possible. Benjamin started to turn away, then paused. One more thing. If you do this, if you run in December, don't take anything with you that could be traced to this plantation. No clothes that could be recognized, no items that could identify where you came from. And tell your children nothing. If they don't know you're planning to escape, they can't accidentally reveal it. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Sallie standing alone in the stable, clutching the small piece of cloth. For a long time, she didn't move. The choice before her seemed impossibly complex. Run in 3 days as originally planned, or wait and trust a woman she had never met, following a plan that seemed even more dangerous than the first. But in the end, the choice was actually simple. Benjamin was right. If she ran alone again, she would face the exact same dilemma at the exact same crossroads, and this time the consequences would be final. If she wanted to save her children, she needed more than courage. She needed the shepherd. Sallie returned to the main house and hid the piece of cloth with her other contraband. Then she waited, counting down the days to December 3rd, and then letting that date pass without incident. Waited through the dark, cold days of mid-December, watching for the slave trader from Mobile. He came on December 18th, spent 2 hours in Thornton's study, and left without any children. On the night of December 23rd, 1853, Sallie Crane escaped for the second time. This escape was nothing like the first. Sallie moved with purpose and preparation, following a route she had memorized, carrying supplies she had carefully hidden. She knew what to expect now, the exhaustion, the hunger, the constant fear of hearing dogs in the distance. But knowledge didn't make the journey easier. If anything, it made it harder, because she understood just how many things could go wrong. The first 3 nights went smoothly. Sallie traveled northeast through the Alabama wilderness, avoiding roads, crossing streams to confuse any tracking dogs, moving in the careful pattern Benjamin had described. Travel until 2 hours before dawn, then find dense cover and sleep until nightfall. Eat sparingly, drink from moving water only, leave no trace. On the 4th night, she reached a small farmhouse with a quilt hanging in the window, the star pattern Benjamin had shown her. She approached carefully, watching for any sign of a trap. When she finally knocked on the door, a white woman opened it, took one look at her, and said simply, "You're expected. Come in." The woman, who never gave her name, fed Sallie, let her wash, and gave her different clothes, plain homespun that could belong to anyone, with no identifying features. Before dawn, she directed Sallie to a barn a mile north, where she should rest during the daylight hours. "There's a family there, freedmen," the woman said. "Tell them Charlotte sent you. They'll know what to do." And so began a pattern that would repeat across Alabama and into Tennessee, a series of strangers who asked no questions, demanded no explanations, simply provided food, shelter, directions to the next stop. Some were white, some were freed blacks, some were slaves themselves, risking everything to help someone they would never see again. Each time Sallie left one of these safe houses, she marveled at the vast invisible network that connected them. A conspiracy of compassion operating right under the noses of the slave-holding class, silent and efficient and extraordinarily dangerous for everyone involved. She crossed into Tennessee in early January, her feet blistered and bleeding despite the boots one of the helpers had given her. The winter had turned bitter, and on some nights she could see her breath crystallizing in the air. She wrapped herself in the stolen blanket and kept moving, driven by the thought of her children and the promise of the shepherd. The Ohio River appeared in mid-January, a vast sheet of gray water that marked the boundary between slavery and freedom. New Richmond lay on the northern bank, a small settlement of freedmen and abolitionists who had made helping fugitives their purpose. Sallie crossed the river in a small boat, piloted by a black man who asked her only one question. "First time crossing?" "Second time running," she answered. "First time crossing." He nodded as if this made perfect sense and said nothing more until they reached the opposite shore. New Richmond consisted of perhaps 30 buildings clustered along the riverbank. Simple structures, but clean and well-maintained. Sallie was directed to a church at the center of the settlement, where she found a dozen other fugitives, all recently arrived, all carrying the same expression of exhausted disbelief that they had actually made it. And there, in that church, Sallie met the shepherd. She was not what Sallie expected. The stories had made her seem almost mythical, but the woman who approached her was simply a woman, perhaps 40 years old, with gray streaking her hair and the calm, assessing gaze of someone who had seen every variation of human desperation and learned not to flinch from it. "You're Sallie," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. You made good time, faster than I expected." The shepherd gestured to a bench. "Sit. You look exhausted." "I need to go back," Sallie said immediately. "My children—" "I know, Benjamin told me, but you're not going anywhere right now. You need to rest, heal, and prepare. What you're proposing is extremely difficult, and if you rush into it, you'll fail." Over the next 2 weeks, Sallie learned what it would take to return for her children. The shepherd had done this before, not often, but enough times to have developed methods that gave a reasonable chance of success. "The key," she explained, "is that you can't go back the same way you escaped. Thornton will have increased security. He'll expect you to return and he'll be watching for you. So instead, you'll approach from a different direction, posing as a house slave hired out from another plantation. I know people in Georgia who can provide documentation, forged but convincing. You'll need to stay in the area for a few weeks, working, establishing yourself as someone legitimate. Then, when the moment is right, you'll take your children and run. But this time, you'll have help waiting at each stage." It was more complicated than Sallie had imagined, but also more possible. The shepherd had connections, resources, and experience. She had helped families reunite before. But there was a problem. "The timing is wrong," the shepherd said. "January and February are the worst months for this kind of operation. The days are short, the weather is unpredictable, and people are watching their slaves more carefully, because winter is when most escape attempts happen. You'd have a better chance if you waited until spring, when the days are longer and the roads are busier." "Spring?" Sallie felt panic rising in her chest. "That's months away. What if they sell my children before then?" "It's a risk," the shepherd acknowledged, "but it's a smaller risk than trying this operation in winter. If you attempt it now, you'll probably be caught. If you wait, you'll have a real chance." Sallie wanted to argue, to insist that she couldn't wait, that every day apart from her children was unbearable. But she had learned something crucial from her first escape. Impulsive decisions led to failure. Strategic thinking gave her a chance. She agreed to wait. Those 3 months in New Richmond were the strangest of Sallie's life. She was free, truly free, for the first time since birth. She could walk wherever she wanted, speak without permission, earn wages for her work. The community welcomed her, gave her a place to stay, and several families offered her permanent employment if she chose to remain. But Sallie spent every day preparing to leave. She worked in various households, learning to forge the behaviors and speech patterns of a hired slave rather than a fugitive. She memorized new routes, new safe houses, new signals. She saved every penny she earned, knowing she would need money for the return journey. And every night she lay awake thinking about Louisa, Beatrice, Thomas, and Marcus, wondering if they thought she had abandoned them, wondering if Thornton had told them that she had run away and would never return, wondering if they hated her for leaving. The shepherd seemed to understand these thoughts without Sallie having to speak them aloud. "They won't hate you," she said one evening. "They'll be frightened and confused, but they won't hate you, because children have a way of understanding love even when they don't understand the circumstances. And what you're doing, this is love in its purest and most dangerous form." In early April of 1854, the shepherd declared that Sallie was ready. The plan was set. The forged papers were prepared, identifying Sallie as a slave named Mary, hired out from a plantation in Georgia to work for a family in Grove Hill, Alabama, less than 20 miles from the Thornton plantation. She would work there for 3 weeks, establishing her cover. Then, on a specified night, she would walk to the Thornton property, find her children, and escape with them using a route that would take them west into Mississippi before turning north, a counterintuitive direction that pursuers wouldn't expect. Once you take them, you'll have maybe 12 hours before the alarm is raised, the shepherd said. That's not much time to get 4 children far enough away to be safe, so you'll need to move fast, and you'll need them to obey you without question. Can they do that? They can, Sallie said with certainty. She had raised her children to be resilient, to understand that survival sometimes meant doing difficult things without explanation. Then may God go with you, the shepherd said, because from here on out, the plan only works if everything goes right. One mistake, one bad piece of luck, one person who doesn't do what they're supposed to do, and you'll all be captured. I understand, Sallie said. She didn't add what she was thinking, that she would rather die trying to free her children than live safely without them. That freedom without them was just another kind of slavery. That this was not about courage or heroism, but about the simple, terrible mathematics of a mother's love. On April 12th, 1854, Sallie Crane returned to Alabama under an assumed name, carrying forged papers with a plan that required perfect execution and extraordinary luck. What she didn't know was that Robert Thornton had spent the last 4 months developing his own plan, one that would turn Sallie's love for her children into the trap that would finally break her completely. Just when we thought we understood Sallie's journey, everything is about to change. Leave a comment if you've been moved by this story, because what happens next will test the limits of what one person can endure. The family in Grove Hill who hired Mary were named Larson, and they were exactly as the shepherd had described. Northern transplants, uncomfortable with slavery, but not opposed enough to reject it outright. Guilty enough to treat their hired help with a degree of courtesy that made them easy to manipulate. Sallie worked in their household for 3 weeks, performing her duties flawlessly while gathering information about the surrounding area. She learned which roads were regularly patrolled, which families kept dogs, which plantations had recently experienced runaway attempts and were therefore on high alert. She also heard news from the Thornton plantation, delivered inadvertently by Mrs. Larson, who enjoyed gossip. That terrible business with the Thornton slave, she said one afternoon while Sallie was serving tea to her guests. The woman who ran away twice. Robert Thornton is still searching for her, can you imagine? He's convinced she'll try to come back for her children, though I can't imagine why she would risk it. What happened to the children? One of the guests asked. Oh, they're still there, working in the house and fields. Thornton won't sell them. He says they're his insurance that the mother will eventually return. Some say he wants her back just so he can make an example of her. A public whipping, or worse. Sallie's hands had trembled slightly as she poured the tea, but she kept her expression neutral, the mask of polite servitude perfectly maintained. The children were still there. Her gamble had paid off. Thornton had kept them specifically because he expected Sallie to return, which meant she had been right. They were his weapon against her, but also her reason to risk everything. On the night of May the 1st, exactly 3 weeks after her arrival in Grove Hill, Sallie informed Mrs. Larson that her sister in town was ill, and she had permission to visit her that evening. It was a weak lie, but Mrs. Larson was already preparing for bed, and too drowsy with her own laudanum to question it closely. Sallie walked out of the Larson house with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle containing food, water, and a knife. She moved quickly through the darkened streets of Grove Hill, then out into the countryside, heading south toward the Thornton plantation. She arrived near midnight, approaching from the west as planned, moving through fields she had once known as well as her own hands. Everything looked the same. The main house with its windows dark, the quarters where the slaves slept, the outbuildings arranged like pieces on a game board. But something felt wrong. Sallie paused at the edge of the tree line, every instinct screaming at her to stop, to observe, to wait. The plantation was too quiet. There should have been sounds, dogs, night birds, the creaking of buildings settling. Instead, there was only silence, thick and oppressive. She almost turned back, almost trusted her instincts and retreated into the darkness. But then she saw a small figure emerge from the quarters, one of the children. She couldn't tell which one in the darkness, but the size and movement were right. The figure walked toward the well, and Sallie felt her heart leap. One of her children, right there, less than 100 yards away. She stepped out of the tree line and moved quickly across the open ground. The figure at the well turned, and even in the darkness, Sallie could see her daughter's face. Beatrice, 10 years old now, grown thin but recognizable. "Mama." The word was barely a whisper. "Yes, baby. It's me. Where are your sister and brothers?" "In the quarters, sleeping." "Mama, you came back." "Hush, sweetheart, we don't have time. I need you to wake them quietly. Tell them to come to the well, and don't let anyone else hear. Can you do that?" Beatrice nodded and ran back to the quarters. Sallie waited by the well, her entire body tense, counting the seconds. This was taking too long. They should have been gone already. 3 small figures emerged from the quarters, Louisa, Thomas, and Marcus. They ran to their mother, and Sallie had to physically restrain herself from crying out as she held them. They had all grown so much. Louisa was almost as tall as Sallie now. Thomas had lost the roundness of early childhood, and Marcus was no longer a toddler, but a small boy. "Listen to me very carefully," Sallie whispered urgently. "We're going to leave here right now, tonight. We're going to walk a long way, and it's going to be difficult, but I need you all to be brave and silent. Don't ask questions, don't cry, just follow me and do exactly what I tell you. Do you understand?" 4 heads nodded in the darkness. "Then let's—" The lantern light flooded across them before Sallie could finish the sentence. William Pike stepped out from behind the smokehouse, holding a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. Behind him came Robert Thornton, and behind Thornton 4 more men, neighbors by the look of them, armed and ready. "I told you she'd come back," Thornton said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. "I told you all she'd come back for them eventually." Sallie pushed her children behind her, placing her body between them and the men. Her mind raced through possibilities, escape routes, but they were surrounded, and the children were too young to run fast enough. "Evening, Sallie," Pike said. "We've been expecting you." "This was a trap," Sallie said slowly, understanding crystallizing. "You knew I would come." "Of course I knew," Thornton said, stepping closer. "I've been watching for you since March. We've had men stationed here every night for the last 6 weeks waiting. The question was never whether you'd return, but when." "The child at the well." "I told Beatrice to go to the well at midnight," Thornton said. "I told her that if she did, I'd give her extra food tomorrow. I suspected you were nearby watching, and children are such useful bait, don't you find?" Sallie felt sick. She had walked directly into a trap, and she had brought her children with her into the center of it. "What now?" she asked. "Now we have choices to make," Thornton said. "You've embarrassed me twice with your escapes. You've cost me time, money, and reputation. The other plantation owners have been asking why I can't control my own property, suggesting that I'm weak. That ends tonight." He gestured to Pike, who stepped forward with a length of rope. "You'll be bound and held until morning, when the entire county can witness what happens to slaves who run. It will be educational and permanent. As for your children—" "Don't," Sallie said. "Please, I'll do anything. Just don't hurt them." "I wasn't planning to hurt them," Thornton said. "I was planning to sell them. All 4, to different buyers, as far apart as possible. By this time next week, they'll be scattered from Texas to Florida, and you'll never see them again. That seems a fitting punishment for your defiance." It was in that moment, with her children terrified behind her and men with weapons closing in, that Sallie made her third and final impossible choice. She had run for freedom twice, and both times her love for her children had brought her back. That love had been used against her, weaponized, turned into chains more effective than any iron. Thornton thought he understood this, thought he had finally won by making her choose between her own freedom and her children's presence. But he had miscalculated one crucial factor. Sallie Crane had stopped making choices based on what she wanted and started making choices based on what was right. "I have a different proposal," she said quietly. Thornton raised an eyebrow. "You're in no position to negotiate. Let them go. Let my children walk out of here tonight with safe passage north. In exchange, I'll stay. I'll submit to whatever punishment you want. I'll never attempt to escape again. I'll work every day for the rest of my life without complaint. But my children go free." The men laughed. One of them, a plantation owner from Grove Hill, said, "That's not how this works, girl. You don't get to bargain." But Thornton held up a hand, silencing them. He was looking at Sallie with an expression of genuine curiosity. "Let me understand this correctly," he said. "You're offering to give up any chance at freedom, submit to severe punishment, and spend the rest of your life in slavery. If I release 4 valuable pieces of property that belong to me that I can sell for substantial profit? Yes. Why would I possibly agree to that?" "Because," Sallie said, and her voice was steady now, certain, "keeping me here under those terms is worth more than selling my children. Think about it. A slave who would trade her freedom for her children's freedom, who would voluntarily choose slavery over liberty, that's a powerful story. That's a story you can tell to prove that slaves prefer the security of plantation life to the uncertainty of freedom. That's propaganda worth more than any price the children would fetch." There was a long silence. Sallie could see Thornton considering it, turning the idea over in his mind. "And if I refuse?" he finally asked. "Then you'll have to explain to everyone tomorrow morning why you needed 6 armed men to capture 1 unarmed woman and 4 children. You'll have to explain why your security was so poor that I managed to escape twice and infiltrate your property a 3rd time. People will ask questions about competence, about control. The embarrassment you mentioned? It'll get worse, not better." More silence. Sallie could feel her children pressed against her back, trembling but silent. She silently prayed they would forgive her for what she was about to do. "I won't sell them," Thornton said finally, "but I won't free them either. They'll be bound out to different plantations, hired labor, with contracts that bring them back here every year. They'll be separated but alive and accounted for. And you'll remain here under strict supervision as an example of the maternal devotion that proves the benevolence of our system." It wasn't freedom. It wasn't even close to what Sallie had hoped for. But it was life, and it was the possibility that someday, somehow, her children might find their own paths to liberty. "I agree," Sallie said. And that was how Sallie Crane's 3rd escape ended, not in freedom, but in a different kind of victory that no one watching quite understood. The whipping happened at dawn, in front of the assembled slaves from 3 different plantations. Thornton made it a spectacle just as he had promised. 20 lashes, delivered by pike with mechanical precision, while Sallie stood tied to a post and made no sound. She had told her children not to watch, but they did anyway, lined up with the other slaves, witnessing what their mother was willing to endure for them. After it was finished, after Sallie collapsed and was taken to the quarters to recover, Thornton addressed the assembled crowd. He spoke about loyalty, about the bonds between slaves and masters, about how Sallie's choice to return proved that freedom was not always preferable to the security of knowing one's place. It was, as Sallie had predicted, propaganda. But it was also her children's lives. Over the next 2 weeks, the children were bound out to different plantations, as Thornton had promised. Louisa went to a family in Grove Hill who needed a house girl. Beatrice was sent to a plantation near Mobile. Thomas and Marcus, considered too young for serious work but old enough to learn, were placed with farmers who paid Thornton a small annual fee for their labor. They were allowed to visit their mother once per year, on Christmas Day, for exactly 1 hour. Sallie lived another 17 years on the Thornton plantation. She worked in the main house until she was too old to manage the physical demands, then was relegated to lighter tasks, mending clothes, shelling peas, supervising the younger house slaves. She never attempted to escape again, and she never spoke about her 3 journeys to anyone who might record them. But the story spread anyway, in the way that slave stories always spread, through whispered conversations, through coded spirituals, through the invisible network that connected every plantation in the South. The story of the woman who escaped 3 times and returned for her children became a legend, told and retold until it took on aspects of myth. Some versions said she had magical powers. Others said she made a deal with the devil. Still others claimed she was helped by angels disguised as abolitionists. The truth was simpler and stranger. Sallie Crane was simply a mother who loved her children more than she loved freedom, and who understood that sometimes the most radical act is not escape, but return. What happened to the children after emancipation in 1865 is a matter of some historical debate. Records from the period are incomplete, and the Thornton plantation was partially burned during a raid in the final months of the Civil War. But there are fragments, census records from 1870 that list 4 individuals with the surname Crane living in different parts of Alabama and Mississippi. A letter discovered in the Ohio Historical Society archive, dated 1873, from a woman named Louisa Crane to a freedmen's school, inquiring about educational opportunities for her children and mentioning that her mother had taught her to read in secret when she was young. And most intriguing of all, a newspaper article from the New Richmond Settlement newspaper in 1868, reporting on the arrival of an elderly, formerly enslaved woman who claimed to have met the shepherd 20 years earlier and was returning to thank her. The woman's name was not recorded, but the article notes that she came from Alabama and had 4 adult children living in the North. Was this Sallie Crane? The evidence is circumstantial, but compelling. What we know for certain is that Sallie died in 1870, at age 47, never having left Clark County, Alabama after her 3rd return. She was buried in the small cemetery behind the quarters, in an unmarked grave among dozens of other unmarked graves. But the fact that her story survived, that it was remembered and repeated and eventually written down, suggests that her choices meant something to the people who witnessed them, something that transcended the brutal mathematics of slavery and spoke to a more fundamental truth about love, sacrifice, and the different forms that freedom can take. There are historians who argue that Sallie Crane made a mistake, that she should have continued north and never looked back, that her maternal instinct was manipulated by Thornton to serve the interests of the slaveholding class, that her story was used as propaganda to justify an evil system. These historians are probably right. But there are other historians who argue that Sallie Crane understood something that her captors never did, that true freedom isn't just about where you live or who controls your labor, but about the ability to make choices that reflect your values, even when those choices come with terrible costs. That by turning back 3 times, she retained a form of autonomy that pure escape could never have given her. These historians are probably also right. The truth, as with most truths about slavery, is complicated and painful, and doesn't resolve into easy lessons. What we're left with is the story itself, of a woman who escaped 3 times, who returned 3 times, who was caught once, and who made a choice that saved her children at the cost of her own freedom. Whether that choice was right or wrong, heroic or tragic, is not for us to judge from our safe distance in time. What we can say is that Sallie Crane faced impossible choices with impossible courage, and that her story, preserved through generations of telling and retelling, continues to ask us the same uncomfortable question. What would you sacrifice for the people you love? And would you have the strength to make that sacrifice 3 times over, knowing each time exactly what it would cost? The Alabama slave Sallie Crane never escaped to permanent freedom, but in a system designed to strip enslaved people of every form of agency, every possibility of choice, every opportunity to act according to their own values and desires, she found a way to choose. 3 times she chose. Perhaps that, in the end, was its own kind of freedom, imperfect, painful, and paid for with a lifetime of suffering, but freedom nonetheless. The Tombigbee River still flows through Clark County, Alabama. The Thornton Plantation is long gone, replaced by modern farms and suburban developments. There is no historical marker commemorating Sallie Crane, no monument to her 3 escapes and 3 returns. But the story persists, passed down through generations, whispered in families, recorded in fragments of letters and diary entries and oral histories. A story that asks us to remember that history is made not just by those who escaped, but also by those who returned. Driven by love, trapped by circumstances, making impossible choices in impossible times. And if you listen carefully on certain nights, in certain quiet places in western Alabama, some people say you can still hear the sound of a woman walking south when everyone expected her to run north, returning again and again for the children she could never quite save and never quite abandon. That is the story of Sallie Crane. A story without heroes or villains, only people making choices in a world designed to rob them of all choice. A story that remains long after the people themselves have turned to dust. This mystery shows us that the past is never as simple as we'd like it to be, and the choices people made under slavery continue to challenge our understanding of freedom, love, and sacrifice. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who appreciate these difficult, necessary histories. These are the stories that must never be forgotten.